Good day everyone, I'm Rachel T. Correo.
And I'm Joy Gaviran.
Our topic is about disaster risk reduction and management. DRR is a part of sustainable development, so it must involve every part of society, government, non-governmental organizations, and the professional and private sector. It therefore requires a people-centered and multi-sector approach, building resilience to multiple, cascading, and interacting hazards and creating a culture of prevention and resilience. What is disaster risk reduction? Disaster risk reduction is a term used for reducing and preventing disaster risk. It is founded on the principle that while hazards are inevitable, its adverse effects like lost lives and or destruction of property are not. What is disaster risk management? Disaster risk management is the application of disaster risk reduction policies and strategies to prevent new disaster risks, reduce existing disaster risks, and manage residual risks, contributing to the strengthening of resilience and reduction of disaster losses. Key concepts of DRR. Number 1. Disaster. The UNISDR 2009 defines a disaster as a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society involving widespread human, material, or environmental losses and impacts which exceeds the ability of the affected community to cope using only its own resources. Number 2. Risk and disaster risk. Risk has a various connotations within different disciplines. In general, risk is defined as the combination of the probability of an event and its negative consequences. Number 3. Hazard. A hazard is defined as a dangerous phenomenon, substance, human activity, or condition that may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impacts, property damage, loss of livelihoods and services, social and economic disruption, or environmental damage. Number 4. Vulnerability. It is defined as the characteristic and circumstances of a community, system, or asset that make it susceptible to the damaging effect of a hazard. Number 5. Coping capacity. Coping capacity for disaster risk reduction refers to the ability of people, organizations, and systems using available skills and resources to face and manage adverse conditions such as hazards, emergencies, or disasters. Coping capacities contribute to the reduction of disaster risk. Number 6. Resilience. In the natural environment, resilience means that an area or ecosystem under threat is restored to its original pristine state. Key elements of DRR. Number 1. Prevention. The outright avoidance of adverse impact of hazard and related disasters. Prevention expresses the concept and intention to completely avoid potential adverse impacts through action taken in advance. Can be in the form of proper land use or using suitable engineering design. Second is mitigation, the lessening or limitation of the adverse impact of hazard and related disasters. While the adverse impact of hazard often cannot be prevented fully, their scale or severity can be substantially lessened by various strategies and actions. Next is adaptation. The adjustment in natural or human system in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli or their effects which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. This definition addresses the concerns of climate change and is sourced from the Secretariat of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Next is preparedness, the knowledge and capacities developed by governments, professional response and recovery organizations, communities, and individuals to effectively anticipate, response to, and recover from the impacts of likely imminent or current hazard events or conditions. Next is response. The provision of emergency services and public assistance during or immediately after a disaster in order to save lives, reduce health impacts, ensure public safety, and meet the basic subsistence needs of the people affected. Disaster response is a predominantly focused on immediate and short-term needs and is sometimes called disaster relief. Next is recovery. The restoration and improvement where appropriate of facilities, livelihood, and living conditions of disaster-affected communities, including effort to reduce disaster risk factors. The recovery task of rehabilitation and reconstruction begins soon after the emergency phase has ended and should be based on pre-existing strategies and policies that facilitate clear institutional responsibilities for recovery action and enable public participation. The concept of disaster has changed over time. In early human civilization, many cultures viewed disaster as a sign of bad luck or an act of God. However, the development of science started changing this perception of disasters. Some of the factors that contributed to this change are: first is social science. Threat hazard as external agents that communities can identify and react to. See disasters as expression of social vulnerability. Number 2, natural science. Emphasize on the hazard component, hydrometeorological, geodynamic, and or technological. Understanding the dynamic of hazard, quantifying the impact of hazards. Number 3, recent studies on disaster risk, understanding of disaster in both social and natural science perspective. Next is community-based disaster risk reduction management. Communities are the first responders in case of a disaster. Therefore, community-based disaster risk reduction should be the core of any risk reduction approach. Disaster risk reduction focuses more on reducing underlying risk, encouraging preventive action before a disaster. Disaster risk management, in contrast, focuses on broader aspects of disasters issues from prevention and mitigation to relief, response, and recovery. So, what is community-based disaster risk reduction management? Community-based disaster risk management promotes the involvement of potentially affected communities in disaster risk management at the local level. This includes community assessment of hazard, vulnerabilities, and capacities, and their involvement in planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of local action for disaster risk reduction. Based on past disasters, it has been found that communities become actively involved in search and rescue, relief, and post-disaster recovery. To enhance community participation before a disaster strike, it is important to focus on risk reduction issues, and therefore, CBDRR has become increasingly emphasized. CBDRR emerged as a result of a shift from reactive emergency management to disaster risk reduction. It focuses more on pre-disaster intervention such as prevention, mitigation, and preparedness-related activities. The following are some of salient features that need to keep in mind for community-based disaster risk reduction. Number 1, urban and rural communities. There are distinct differences in urban and rural communities. In the rural communities, CBDRR can be a development vehicle which addresses the development needs of the area, be it health or education or water-related issues. Number 2, age diversity. In several countries, aging population is an increasingly important issue. In the case of Japan, with the population and an aging population, aging or senior citizens are key to CBDRR. In most cases, they are the resident association leaders and effectively become the core of the community activities. In contrast, in urban areas, youth groups are key to CBDRR. However, these two groups require different approaches. In the digital age, in both developed and developing countries, social media are playing an increasingly important role in the development of communities. Therefore, youth groups can be mobilized through increasing use of social media, while senior citizens need a different face-to-face community relation approach. Number 3. Role of external agencies or change agents. In most communities, there exist change agents or leaders. However, their influence is sometimes dormant. Thus, the external agency, either NGO or research academic institution, can play an important role in revitalizing local leaders, emphasizing and recognizing their roles and activities. This needs to be done in a good balance so as not to destroy the local power politics in the community. Number 4. Sustainability issues. One of the key challenges of CBDRR is sustainability. After a major disasters event, there are external and internal agencies that keep the momentum of CBDRR as long as the resources exist. Disaster can be development opportunities, and it is important to think how the disaster recovery process can be core to longer-term sustainability of the CBDRR. For that institutionalization of CBDRR, efforts at the local governance level is very important. Number 5. People's accountability. One of the key issues of CBDRR is to be a responsible citizen. DRR is not just a state responsibility, it belongs to every citizen, both individually and collectively. After a disaster, people often turn to the government for subsidy or support, and they receive different types of the internal and external assistance. However, it is the primary responsibility of citizens to protect their assets by themselves and to make sure that preventive measures are taken at the individual and family levels. This is especially applicable to different types of small disasters, the preparedness for which is accumulated to cope with the mega disasters. Thus, a self and community accountability check is key to CBDRR. In summary, while the importance of CBDRR is recognized at the national and local levels, its nature is changing over time. To make CBDRR effective, it needs to be linked to local needs and priorities, and disaster issues and other social needs need to be addressed together. The nature of community is also changing, and therefore, new media like social networking needs to be used effectively for successful community-based disaster risk reduction. That's all. Thank you for watching.